Okay, so after Mozambique?
Yeah, after Mozambique, I was assigned to the State Department to a job working on NATO affairs in the European Bureau. I had some background in Europe and NATO affairs previously from my previous experience, so I became a deputy director of the office there, and I was in charge of the NATO piece of that office. And it was a very interesting time. You remember, this was now 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Big questions about the future of Europe and the security structures and where the countries that had formerly been a part of the Warsaw Pact were going to wind up. And 94, this was the summer of 94, I came back, and President Clinton had determined that he supported the idea of enlarging NATO, of bringing new members in, and hired Richard Holbrooke to be the Assistant Secretary for Europe to make this happen. And I have to tell you, Anna, it was my worst professional experience dealing with Richard Holbrooke, who was an impossible man. That's not very popular in certain circles, I know, to say that, to speak the truth about him, but he was a brutal guy to work for. And I've had, tough bosses before, but Holbrooke sort of was enamored of his own brilliance and not shy about letting you know it, and also a bully by nature, and sort of liked making people feel small. So it was not a good experience. The best thing that ever happened to me was the tragedy in Sarajevo, where the American Bob Frazier and a couple other people were killed in an accident on Mount Igman.
Ron Brown.
Right. And Holbrooke came back from that. In between, Holbrooke had been told that he had to make peace in Yugoslavia. And it was fascinating to watch him trying to avoid getting tagged with this, because he knew he was being set up to be the fall guy for a failed process. And he wanted no part of it, and he was squirming and trying to get out of it. But dutifully, did what he was told and got involved. Then this tragedy at Mount Igman happened, and he came back transformed. I mean, I went out to the airport with a lot of my colleagues from the European Bureau to meet the plane where they brought the bodies back, and Holbrooke came off the plane, and he was shaken. I mean, you could see this. And I mean, to his credit, it had a deep psychological impact. He decided, despite the setup in Washington and the bad politics and the sheer difficulty of the problem, he was going to make it work. And out of this, the Dayton process was born. And I have to say, I mean, it was, for all of its limitations, it was a real success. And that is due, I think, to the personal drive and commitment of one guy. For me, the good news was it got him off my back on a daily basis about NATO enlargement, which was the big issue on the NATO side. He just didn't have time to be worried about that anymore. And it was a lot easier working on these issues without him parachuting in every 6 weeks, telling you you're a fool and didn't know what you were doing, and start over again. One of the funniest things that happened was the UN General Assembly was going on in New York. This had to have been the autumn of 96. I forget the dates now. Either 95 or 96. Must have been 95. Yes, 95. And the phone rings, and it's Dick Holbrooke. Chris, I have a meeting this afternoon with Tudjman and blah, blah, blah. You need to come and take the Quint meeting. Now, the Quint was the US, Germany, France, the UK. I guess it was the Quad meeting. It was held by political directors. Here I am, I'm a mid-level officer at the State Department. I get on a plane, go to New York, and the political directors of the British Foreign Ministry, the German Foreign Ministry, all these people, Pauline Neville-Jones, Wolfgang Ischinger, all these very senior diplomats, and there's this nobody FSO 2 sitting there representing Holbrooke and telling him what was going to happen, what it had to be. I could see them all not being very happy at what they considered to be kind of a slap in the face by Holbrooke, which I imagine it was meant to be. Anyway, I spent 2 years basically working on NATO enlargement. And I was the principal author of writing the U.S. government instructions that went out to our NATO colleagues negotiating this process. It was called the NATO enlargement study, and it was meant to be a study of whether or not the alliance should enlarge and under what circumstances and how. And of course, a lot of opposition to it within the alliance, a lot of opposition to it coming from Moscow, which I think it's fair to say continues to this day. But at the end of the day, the study was approved, and it set the stage then for the first enlargement a couple of years later, where Poland was brought in. Gosh, I forget now who else, but it was the start of a process of a succession of enlargements. And a lot of revisionist historians talk about how the US was wrong to lead this process and NATO was wrong to expand. And this has led a bad taste. This has led Putin to be what he is today and seeking revenge for the humiliation. And what the revisionists always conveniently forget was the tremendous effort made to include Russia in this process, to find new ways of reaching out to them, and including them not as an ally, but in a closer relationship to NATO. I think the US even dallied with the idea a little bit of Russia as actually joining NATO, but the Europeans would have no part of it. It's something that's often forgotten. Those who were closest wanted nothing to do with it. But what the revisionists, I think, always really, where their analysis always fails is, so what would you have done with all these countries if you didn't offer them a path forward to the West? Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, as it still then was, I think, etc., all the rest of them. Where do you leave them? Trapped in a gray zone between an angry, resentful Moscow seeing its old empire disappear from it and an ever more prosperous and integrated West. I mean, there was no third choice. I mean, they were going to be part of something. What was it going to be? And I think the decision was the right one, to bring them closer to the West and to do what had been done for Portugal and Spain a decade earlier, of offering them a place in the Western structures. Now, they had both, of course, been NATO allies all along, but the EU here. And I think that was the right call, and it was a visionary decision to sort of offer them the stability and the security of being part of something bigger and something that was pro-Western and democratic, liberal democratic in its orientation. And I think the success of those countries post-1989 speaks for itself, by and large. Those that were brought in first have done the best. Those that lagged behind have suffered the most and have really, to this day, are not doing as well as the countries that came in early.
And this was the time when you started also getting a little bit more acquainted with the situation
in the region,
Yugoslavia?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I got a bit involved in that. My job at the first Dayton meeting was to be the errand boy who organized the sandwiches for the negotiators, but that's typical for a career diplomat to be involved at that level.
So you were at Dayton?
No, this was in Washington. Before they moved. You know, Holbrooke only realized he needed to isolate everybody away from distractions and the media glare, and so keep them holed up later, and that's when they found the air base to do it at. But I was always tangential to the Dayton process. I wasn't really deeply involved in it. My real exposure to the region begins with my next assignment, which was to Bulgaria. I had the good fortune of getting to know and work for, when I was on the Spain-Portugal desk, the office director was a woman named Avis Bolin. She's the daughter of a very famous diplomat, Chip Bolin, who was one of the wise men, president of the creation. And subsequently, she was in a more senior position in the European Bureau, and I was working on the NATO affairs. And she then got nominated to be our ambassador to Bulgaria, and she asked me if I'd go along and be her deputy. I said immediately yes, and I thought it was a great opportunity because she's a very skillful diplomat and a good boss, and I really like her. We're friends to this day. And so that was my first exposure, then my first time serving in what we used to call Eastern Europe. Now it's called South Central Europe, I believe, but I went off and did a year of Bulgarian language training. I wound up in Sofia then in the summer of 1997.
Where things were starting heating up in Kosovo.
Where things were heating up in Kosovo. Bulgaria was going through its own crisis. their economy had collapsed in the winter of 96, 97. I mean, there were shortages of food and everything at that point. The country was only sort of coming out of its own economic implosion. We had our hands full there again, doing a lot of it, helping them kind of sort of recover from the low point that they had reached. But I became involved in Kosovo pretty much. I mean, there were issues early on about petrol smuggling into Yugoslavia from Bulgaria, and kind of black market stuff going on around the edges. Really got involved though at the time of the NATO air campaign. I to this day maintain that I was, if not the only, one of the only American diplomats who came under fire during the air campaign.
Literally or metaphorically?
So I was close to literally. Where I lived in Sofia was sort of toward the western outskirts of town. And one night I was at the gym that I belonged to, taking a shower when there was this tremendous explosion. And one of our missiles had gone astray and gone through the roof of a house about 1 kilometer away from where I was standing. So I think that allows me to say I came closer than anybody else being shot at. It turns out that missiles, like fine wine, missile fuel ages and it burns more slowly. And during the air campaign, these anti-radar sight missiles that we had, we'd fire one at the Yugoslavs who learned to turn off their radars pretty quickly. And then the missile would go back into seeking mode, looking for a target. The Bulgarians were using the same radar sets and were curious and were watching what was going on with their radars. So the missiles would pick up the Bulgarian signal. And so we figured out subsequently that there were a series of about 6 of these missiles that hit within a kilometer either side of a straight line at this radar site in Bulgaria. Well, we told Bulgarians they really need to turn their radar off because it was sooner or later it was going to get hit. And this was beyond the range of these missiles because the fuel was old and they traveled more slowly but went longer distances. So that's how I came under fire in the Kosovo Air War.
It's about, next year will be the 20th anniversary of the intervention.
Already?
Yeah. What do you think of the intervention? At the time, if you could tell me at the time, did you think it was the right thing to do? Or?
Very much so. I mean, I knew enough of what was going on at this point to understand the aggressive ethnic cleansing that was underway in Kosovo by the Serbs, and I believed we needed to stop it. So I never had any qualms about the intervention. We'd already gone through Bosnia and Croatia and all these wars, and there was a track record there that you knew you couldn't just stand idly by and hope that Milosevic and Belgrade were suddenly going to, just start behaving themselves. So no, I've never had any qualms about the correctness of the decision to intervene and to stop Serbia in its tracks. I think we did so pretty effectively, with a minimal loss of life on all sides. We can talk about some of the second-order consequences of that in places like Afghanistan later, but I'm not sure it would have worked if we hadn't adapted our tactics. It was pretty clear that airstrikes alone weren't working, so I think the need to partnership with people on the ground, i.e. the KLA, was something we learned in the course of it, and I think then it made our intervention much more effective. And of course, Milosevic changed his tactics, and when he started, support for this was wavering in the West, but when the images started coming out of the entire population being expelled and sort of forced to walk down the railroad lines, and refugees in Macedonia, etc., I think he spelled his own doom at that point. His tactic failed. He didn't take into account Western public reaction to the images that came out, and I think that shored up support for the intervention at a time when it had been wavering, and allowed us to push through to success.
When was the first time you went to Kosovo?
The very first time then would have been February of 2000, maybe late January, but I think it was February. And you'll recall that was a very tough winter, very bleak. And you come up from, I drove from Sofia to Skopje and was met there by a security team who brought me up the Kachanik Gorge to Pristina. And I don't remember the gorge so clearly. I remember coming out of it and these empty fields, kind of very bleak. Everything was gray and brown, weeds sticking up, trash everywhere. And we were stuck behind a German tank transporter moving till the turnoff to Prizren. And the only color I remember seeing was Albanian flags and the American flag. Everywhere you looked, these two flags. That was my first impression, quite dramatic. And then getting to Pristina, the first night I was there, we went to have dinner. First 1 or 2 nights, we were living in the same facility where the U.S. Embassy is still based today, but it was everybody living in a room, kind of a dormitory situation. It was all pretty primitive. There were no services, so there were big Vietnam-era generators pounding all day and night for electricity on the compound. But going to have dinner at Bernard Kouchner's residence somewhere in town, and our big, heavy, armored SUV couldn't stop on the hill. We basically just toboggan sledded down this hill. I don't know how we weren't all killed. It was skillful driving by the guy at the wheel. It was just so icy. Of course, nobody had cleared any snow or ice that winter. There was a complete breakdown of all services. No trash collection. Keck was, to the extent it was operating at all, it was spewing out. When it snowed red from whatever was coming out of the smokestacks. And those are kind of my early kind of visual memories of what Kosovo was.
Why were you there?
Well, in November of '99, Bill Clinton came to Sofia, and we organized a visit, a hugely successful visit by Clinton, first ever visit of an American president to Bulgaria. And during the course of that, several of the senior people in the European Bureau reached out to me and said, "We're looking for someone to run the U.S. office in Pristina. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Well, let me talk to my wife, but in principle, yes." And that's what happened. In February, the guy who had set the office up, Larry Rawson, a colleague, was leaving, and they wanted me to go there and overlap with him for at least a week to just get a feel for things and kind of see what it was all about. So that's why I went. I was preparing to take over the U.S. office. I went back to Sofia, wrapped up my affairs to a certain extent, and then went back to Pristina like a week or 2 later. In the meantime, the gym had burned. You remember that big swooping building that was the old sports center from Yugoslav times? That had burned to the ground in the 2 weeks I was gone. It was pretty wow, what a change just in that time. But
and what was your first big assignment in Kosovo? What was the thing that you remember? How long was your tenure?
Well, I wound up being there for 18 months. It was supposed to be a year, but in the course of that, was nominated to become ambassador in Angola, and I didn't need to leave at the 1 year mark in February, so I stayed on through the summer when I got a chance to welcome George Bush there as president. So I got kind of the bookend with the two presidents. I think the first big thing that happened, that at least I can recall now, was actually negotiating the Preševo Valley ceasefire. You recall that there was this guerrilla movement going on in Preševo, and I remember going down to Jakova, and again playing sort of the mediator role with the Albanians. It had to negotiate kind of an agreement between the Faci Albanians and the Preševo Albanians to sort of try and control this and put an end to the struggle. And boy, you do forget, but I forget all the terms of the discussion, but that's what happened. And the leader of the Preševo Albanians was named, what was it, Janusz? He wound up in jail subsequently.
I don't remember
Sorry?
Uchapamaba was the movie.
Uchapamaba was the organization.
And
right?
maybe you were in Gilan, not in Gilan.
Gilan, sorry, Gilan. Yeah, I forget the names too. It was Gilan. And we spent a tough day there negotiating, but Facci was able to eventually get these guys to agree that they needed a ceasefire. They shouldn't be shooting. And of course, that remained a fragile situation long afterwards, and still a subject. Like I say, it's like a soap opera. I mean, these storylines go on. But the ceasefire largely held. There were occasional incidents. I can recall the first time we went out to, there was I think it was called OP-63, but it was an overlook into the Preševo Valley where the U.S. Army had established a watch post. And sort of peering through binoculars into this very troubled region. And to my surprise, realizing that in the distance I could see Bulgaria, the mountains of Western Bulgaria. The shock of just how small the geography we're talking about is. I mean, it was in a direct line, probably 30 or 40 kilometers at most. I mean, southern Serbia at that point is very narrow. Maybe a little bigger than that, but anyway, you can see the mountains of Bulgaria. Yeah, exactly. Or in fact, being in Maputo and not being able to drive to South Africa, which you can do in 45 minutes now. The thing I really sort of was most pleased about being able to do, which I think I would fairly or not take personal credit for, in the run-up to the Yugoslav elections in, when was that? The October of 2001? No, it must have been 2000. I was gone by then.
2000, yeah.
Get instructions from Washington. The UN has to go and observe these elections inside of Kosovo. Not observe them in the sense of, validating them or being in the polling places, but we wanted to ensure, we wanted to know how many people showed up at the polling places that day. Because what everybody expected, Milosevic was going to claim there were 200,000 votes in Kosovo and 98% of them had supported him and steal the elections that way. And so the goal was to be able to say, no, we know that X number of people entered the polling station that day. And X would be way below 200,000. We don't know how they voted, we have no idea, but only this is the maximum number of voters there could have been. And so with these instructions, going to see Bernard Kouchner and saying, Bernard, here's what you got to do for us. And it was late in the afternoon in his offices down there in the government building. And I remember he broke out a bottle of Johnny Walker Red, and we sat around drinking whiskey, and me persuading him that the UN had to take on this role, which is, as you can imagine, controversial because it comes close to putting the UN in the middle of the political process. Not all the member states were supportive of this, but I had developed a pretty good personal rapport with Kouchner over time, and so I feel that this meeting was really sort of led him to say, yes, it's the right thing to do, and we're going to support that. Jacques Covey, who was the deputy and an American, subsequently told me that, years later, told me that a lot of his staff were very resistant. And he basically said to them, look, the U.S. is the biggest contributor to the UN. They're paying a third of your salaries. This is payback time. We're going to do this. And they did. And we all went around, and I went and watched the elections that day too. From afar, they had people monitoring each polling station. I mean, literally sitting several hundred yards away, watching with binoculars and counting the number of people who went in and out the door that day. So before the election results were announced, we could put out a number. And I believe the number was, I don't remember now. I want to say it was 20,000. There were 20,000 potential voters that day from Kosovo. And of course that prevented Milosevic from claiming he had won a massive, overwhelming majority and therefore had won the elections as a whole.
mentioned your wife before. Is it? Did you meet her in Bulgaria?
Yes. Well, I met her at language training for Bulgaria.
Okay.
Yeah. She was her then husband had won a Fulbright to come to the U.S. She was a young new mother, attending grad school at American University, and the Bulgarian department at the Foreign Service Institute we had a larger than normal class. They needed an extra teacher. So she was hired for 3 months to be a Bulgarian language teacher. It was her first professional job in America. She's now an American diplomat herself and is serving in Pakistan with USAID. We met then, and then we stayed in touch in Bulgaria only because our children are the same age. Her son was 3 months younger than my daughter, and so summers in Bulgaria, they would get together and play, and I got to know the family and stayed in touch. But when I went on to first Kosovo and then Angola, we had lost touch for many years until I was in Zimbabwe, and we rediscovered each other, and by which point we were both divorced and had a different life, and one thing leads to another.
Yes, and in fact, my question was also, leading to this kind of life problematic to keep a family. I mean, if you travel a lot, you moved, just to have a sense of.
It's very hard on families, especially in the modern age where spouses have their own careers. And it's very disruptive to the non-foreign service spouse. If you come back to Washington for a period of years and every 3 or 6 years you're forced to move to another country, what does that do to the spouse's career? The State Department's really wrestled with this, and not very successfully. So a lot of FSOs wind up marrying other foreign service officers, and then you try and manage your careers. What works very well for some people is the trailing spouse, and often these days it's a man as much as a woman, although historically, of course, women were the ones who were expected to sort of follow. Freelance career. I had a colleague in Mozambique, for example, the second time around, she was a graphic designer. With modern technology, she could work for almost anywhere. But yes, it's one of the challenges that the Foreign Service faces, and it's hard on families. It all sounds very romantic and nice, but uprooting every couple of years and having to deal with moving is a nightmare. But new situations, new friends, new bosses, new school for your kids, if that's if you have children. People in the U.S. make a lot about the sacrifice that our military make, and they certainly do. But the Foreign Service isn't far behind in terms of the impact this career has on families. Most of the time, we're not being sent to war zones and shot at, but these days, increasingly, that's the case too. So yeah, it's a real challenge. It's like anything else, there are trade-offs. There are wonderful rewards in the career. You get to go to places and meet people you never would have dreamed of. I'd never thought of going to Africa when I joined the Foreign Service, and opened up a whole part of the world to me I never expected. But there's a cost too.
When you were in Kosovo, there was immediately, this was really, really post-conflict.
Yes.
Because the war had ended a few months ago. How did it compare to maybe a place like Mozambique? I mean, did you feel safe? Did you feel safer?
When I first got to Kosovo, it was my first experience at having my own security detail. It was the first country I'd lived in where that was necessary. And these were very high-end professionals, military units that have since gone on to become quite famous for other reasons. But I never felt unsafe, maybe because of their presence. I never felt unsafe. I think there was the potential risk that Milosevic might try something, so that's the reason they were there. But as far as the Albanian people were concerned, they would have protected me long before my security detail needed to. I never felt unsafe at all that way. There was a landmine risk. unexploded ordnance and all that, so you knew you had to be careful where you walk, and going out in the unknown meadows was not something very advisable. No, but overall, I liked it from the very start. I felt good being there. I felt we were welcomed, obviously. I felt the work was rewarding. God knows it was challenging, especially in the beginning. I was living in a single room. I won't shock your audience too much with the story of the rat that was on me in my bed 3 times one night, including the last on my neck. Conditions were rough. I got a cat. That solved that problem. Who only passed away just this year. But it was great. It was exciting. It mattered. It was front and center of Washington's attention. I mean, so for a professional career diplomat, it was there was no better place to be, despite the personal difficulties of living in a place like that. But we had electricity, we had water, which is something that a lot of the population had. I mean, one of the big issues we were still dealing with was trying to create warm rooms for people so they could survive the winter, that first winter, when there was just a complete breakdown of all systems and services. So you never felt like you really had the right to complain. I mean, it was for us, it was kind of like living back in a college dorm room, but other people were struggling with a lot more difficult situations. And so it was really rewarding to go back 10 years later, 11 years later, and see the recovery of the country. And I remember going out, and your perspective keeps changing, to one of the villages out there in the Dytë where the Serbs had just gone through the village and hammered it, and everything was burned and shot up and flattened, and the mosque had collapsed and the minaret was down. And I'd never seen such destruction before. But subsequently I was assigned to Angola, as I said, and I saw worse things there. I mean, towns that had been the front line in the civil war for 20 years. It put everything in Kosovo back into a slightly different perspective again. Of course, Kosovo was very fortunate that phase of the struggle was as short as it was. And I can only imagine how, as bad as it was, how much worse it would have been if that had gone on for a couple of years. It would not have been this one village. It would have been, everything would have been shot up the way I saw Angola looking subsequently. Which again reinforces my belief that we did the right thing by intervening to stop that before it got even worse than it already was.
So from Kosovo you jumped from the winter of 2000, which I remember very well, you go to Africa again.
In the autumn of 2001, yeah. Or of course, the spring in Southern Hemisphere, but yes, the October of 2001. I left Kosovo. So George Bush came for a visit. We met at Bondsteel. He spent very few hours in the ground. You remember he got elected on the U.S. Army. The world's finest military doesn't do nation building, and Kosovo was a nation building project. So he didn't come there convinced about all this. This was his predecessor's war, after all.
You were in Kosovo on 9/11.
No.
No.
I had just left. I mean, I had left a few weeks. So I left about a week after Bush's visit.
Okay.
Came back, had my leave and whatever, my Senate hearings, and on 9/11 I was actually in what I jokingly call ambassadorial boot camp in the State Department, where they kind of run you through this course and they try and bring in career people and political appointees and try and help the political appointees understand what they're getting into, many of whom have no prior government service. And we were sitting in a room in the State Department, and all these people started scurrying in and out. So something's going on. At the break, one of our instructors sort of says, well, there's been a plane has gone into the North Tower, hit for the North Tower. And at the break, we turn on the TV, and just as we did, the second plane hit the other tower. And the instructors were like, no, there's no problem here. If there were a real threat, diplomatic security would tell us. And I turned to one of my colleagues and said, you know what? I'm getting out of here, because here's a lesson for you, Mr. Political Appointee. Don't rely on DS to save your life. And, minutes later, of course, the plane went into the Pentagon. And I remember at that point, everybody was leaving the State Department. It was pretty clear that something big was going on. So I can remember walking up the street and hearing explosions in the background and seeing the column of smoke coming up from the Pentagon. And meanwhile, everybody was trying to leave town, and it was a huge traffic jam. Nobody could go in. I was staying in a place close by. I could walk. But later that afternoon, the town was eerie. I went out for a walk, and I was looking for a payphone so I could call my mother in New Jersey. This everybody having cell phones. But the cell phone network was down. And how eerily silent Washington was. It was a ghost city. It was a strange day.
And so from there,
To Angola.
which is an interesting place.
Where there was another African civil war underway. Jonas Savimbi and UNITA were still in the closing phases of their struggle against the MPLA government in Luanda. The U.S. had a much more complicated history there than in Mozambique. In Mozambique, we never supported Renamo, although Jesse Helms tried to drag us into that war the way we were involved in Angola. The State Department always resisted and very cleverly published a report in the early 90s, Gersony report, about the Renamo atrocities, which then made them untouchable. And so we never did get dragged in. But we had this history in Angola, of course, although by the time I came there in 2001, we had distanced ourselves from UNITA for 9 years. They refused to accept the results of the 92 elections, went back to war. At that point, we cut them off. And it became much more of a real guerrilla movement at that point. So I got there in October of 2001, and the war was still going on. It felt very much like Mozambique in that Luanda was somewhat isolated. The only way to get around the country was to fly. And because we were providing a lot of aid, a lot of food, we had, a charter aircraft service that we could call on to make trips. So that's when I went to Huambo, and I saw this town that had been the front line in the Civil War for years and years. I mean, literally one side of the street versus the other, and the buildings all shot up and bombed. And then in February of 2002, of course, Savimbi gets killed. And UNITA collapsed almost instantly. And there was a lot of lingering doubt in Washington that they really had collapsed. Because there were a number of people who had these long-standing relationships, they kind of found it hard to let go and to accept the idea that UNITA had, in fact, stopped functioning as a guerrilla movement, as a resistance army. And I had quite a lot of tension with the State Department about this, saying, guys, it's over. You don't understand. This is not a negotiated settlement. The government won. UNITA has been defeated. And the survivors from UNITA, they had been living out in the remote eastern provinces of Angola for years. There was no food. They were surviving on wild honey they would find in the bush. That's a famous story. Savimbi was well fed, and he actually shot his cook for stealing food that was meant for him. Another cook therefore died of starvation rather than risking getting caught stealing food, right? So they were in desperate shape. Savimbi goes, the whole thing collapses. I then find myself doing very familiar things, working with AID to get tin cups and pots and pans and things out to the demobilizing UNITA forces who are being brought into, I forget the name now, we had it, but the demobilization camps. And subsequently, one of the senior leaders in the Africa Bureau at State said, gosh, Chris, you were really on top of things. You really did a good job all on your own, despite us. It was kind of that kind of thing, trying to get things done without Washington, overcoming Washington's resistance. And they launched a formal peace negotiation. Again, it was very much like Mozambique, the two parties. You know, in Angola, there was the troika. The three countries that had been asked by the parties to be involved were Portugal, the United States, and at this point, Russia. And so we were the three international mediating partners. But it didn't really work out like Mozambique, because it really was a different ending. And UNITA half-heartedly was participating in this process and not really putting up much of a fight. There was nothing any of us could do to sort of make them negotiate harder to get more, more democratic norms accepted and, more level playing field for the first elections. And then one day we get called to a meeting and they basically signed surrender documents. They just gave everything away. And I was furious. I called in his name was, his nom de guerre was Gatu, and I forget his real name right now. Everybody in Angola has a nom de guerre. He was Gatu. He was the surviving leader of UNITA. And he came to my office and he's staring at his shoe caps. And I said, I just have one question. How much do you cost? He kind of stared more deeply at his shoe caps. The truth is, the government of Angola bought peace. And although it wasn't a democratic outcome, it didn't build democratic norms into the system and safeguards and the things that we were all hoping to sort of see result from this. The truth is, it was a more definitive end to their war than the one in Mozambique ever had. They paid money to the UNITA guys. They wanted houses and cars and medical treatment. Gato was grateful to the government. He was starving to death. They had to send him to South Africa and take care of him for 6 months, feed him with nutrition regimes to survive. José Eduardo dos Santos, for whatever his many faults as a leader, understood that he had the resources to secure a lasting peace in Angola, and he did. It didn't lead to the kind of democratic government we want, but the country has never looked back, and there's never been any hint that the war would re-erupt in Angola, the way there's kind of this lingering, slow-burning embers of that in Mozambique to this day, 24 years later, almost a quarter of a century later. So very different outcomes. Once again, the international crowd were all running around, peace and reconciliation process, because we just had Bishop Tutu doing reconciliation in South Africa, so this was the flavor of the day. And again, the Angolans wanted no part of it. And I mean ordinary Angolans. Most ordinary Angolans just wanted it to be over and forgotten, and move on, and spend their efforts and have us spend our efforts on helping them get back on their feet and rebuild their lives, rather than settling scores with who did what to who when. So that was Angola. It was quite an exciting time because you really did see this kind of recovery begin, and pretty quick, people coming out of the bush in terrible states. And I like to take pictures as a hobby. And one of the most haunting pictures I've ever taken are of these people, stick figures really, emerging from the bush in the central highlands of Angola. And this one picture, it's very kind of affecting, is this young woman lying with her head in her daughter's lap, and the daughter picking nits out of her hair, because that was all the mother was clearly dying of starvation. And all the daughter could do to help her was try and, get the lice out of her hair. The woman was probably dead a few hours later because it was too late, even for therapeutic feeding. Another one of an old man wearing rags that have turned the color of earth, kind of reddish yellow, squatting, picking up fallen grains of corn. There had been a food distribution, American corn being distributed by the World Food Program. And this guy getting there too late or not qualifying in some way, sitting there picking individual kernels of corn out of the dirt. That's the kind of country it was at that point. Meanwhile, of course, diamonds and oil are making people in Luanda vastly rich. And one of my takeaway lessons from that was the unintended consequences of well-meaning intervention, which probably applies in some senses to Kosovo, but one of them was over 40 years of civil war, first the colonial struggle, but mostly the civil war, 20 years of civil war, the government in Luanda, the lesson they had drawn was the well-being of those people in the interior, where the guerrillas are operating, they're not our problem. That's for the internationals to deal with. This reflects ethnic tensions and things in the country too, but there was a real lack of commitment to doing anything to help these people who were in desperate straits. And that kind of remains a challenge in Angola to this day, I think, although I haven't spent much time there subsequently, where you see Luanda has become this cancerous, monstrously big city where lots of people are going because there's still more going on there, however desperate life is and what terrible conditions they live in. Nonetheless, it's better there than out in the countryside where things are still struggling to get back on their feet.